Hello, everybody. Martin Braden here. I'm coming to you from the beautiful city of Bountiful, Utah. As you can see, I finally got my first revenue share check from YouTube, which paid for this wonderful new mic system, which is something I promised all of you a couple months ago. I want to tell the 10,000 plus new subscribers that recently joined my channel over the past 90 days what I'm talking about here. I had promised my viewers that when I got my first revenue check from YouTube, I would use it to get a good microphone, and that would be the only time I'd use my YouTube earnings to get something for myself, because from then on, I was going to put in a special savings, and that's what I'm doing, is putting any earnings from this into a savings so I can support, all of us can support a new missionary. Even though I needed the mic, no question about it, I chose to wait until I reached this milestone of 350 in revenue. And so as you can see, we did it. I say we because it's all of you subscribers and viewers who decided to hit the like and notification bell buttons, and especially those of you who went the extra mile and shared my videos with family and friends. Y'all made it happen, and so thank you, truly, thank you. And hurrah for helping us reach this milestone. I sincerely hope it's going to make videos that I do better listening experience for you as you watch them and watch me bloviate, as it were. Now, one other quick point. Because there's so many new viewers, I thought I'd take just a quick second or two to tell you a little bit about myself. That way you'd have a better understanding where I'm coming from as you watch my videos. So I grew up in Boise, Idaho, and I lived there until I left on my mission 1 week before my 19th birthday, after serving in the Gulf states for 2 years, which consisted of the states of Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. They being part of the Bible Belt. I came home and I immediately began dating. I must admit that it was a difficult search for the woman of my dreams, but after 13 months of trying to survive that crazy world of dating, I found my wife of 48 years, and we celebrated our 48th anniversary just this past 16th of this month. Over those 48 wonderful years, Kathleen's blessed me with 8 beautiful children, 2 of whom have passed away and gone on to their glory. The remaining 6 living children have blessed us with 15 beautiful grandchildren. And after approximately 3 years of marriage and the birth of our first 4 children, we decided to leave Boise and seek our fortune in California. We lived in West Covina, California for approximately 2 years, had another child there, and then I was given the opportunity to come to Utah and start a new job here. After moving back to Utah, we had 4 more children for a total of 8. We've lived in Bountiful now for the past 35 years, and we loved every minute of it. Okay, with that said, today's video is titled Scholars versus Prophets. To help me with that topic, I've enlisted the help of a very, very special guest who I have the privilege to have on my show today. He's someone whom I consider to be a scholar of LDS church history in particular. So let me introduce you to Jonathan Neville. Welcome, Jonathan, to my channel. Appreciate it, Jonathan.
Hi, happy to be here, and congratulations on your success.
Well, you're kind. It's a start for sure. And these folks who watch are really, I think they really love the messaging behind this series of videos I'm doing, Dispelling the Accusatory Fog. So thank you for helping with this. I think you're going to have some great information to share. Before we jump into that, I realize that the Book of Mormon came to be, as Joseph Smith said it would be, problematic for some folks. I also recognize the implication of not having available the actual plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated. In other words, their absence in our hands disallows their witness to speak for itself. And so with that said, I promise you who are watching this interview with Jonathan, you're going to find that this complex issue is far less problematic and complex than its critics make it out to be. And you'll know that once we're done. So to start off with, Jonathan, let me share your bio for the folks here. Let me just read it because I think it's so special. Jonathan E. Neville is a retired lawyer, educator, businessman, and author. Jonathan was born in California in the United States of America and has lived in 8 states and 5 foreign countries. He has visited over 100 countries around the world. He has studied the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for decades and has pursued evidence for the Book of Mormon wherever it leads him. In his work, he follows the adage, trust but verify, which has led him to many new faith-affirming discoveries. Brother Neville has written numerous books on many topics, including 10 books on LDS church history and the Book of Mormon, specializing in the early church history through the Nauvoo period. Let me name just a few of Jonathan's books he's written. Moroni's America, by means of the Urim and Thummim, restoring translation to the restoration. The rational restoration, a man that can translate, Joseph Smith and the Nephite interpreters. Between these hills, a case for the New York Cumorah. Letter 7, whatever happened to the golden plates? The lost city of Zarahemla and Mesoamania. That to me is a small library. Anything you want to say about those 10 books? And the other, I think you've done 32 or something like that. I'm stunned by that number.
Yeah, there's been lots of them for sure.
Well, that's great. As you well know, Jonathan, mainstream scholarship has concluded that the Book of Mormon is not, I repeat, is not of ancient origin. They theorize, and it is absolutely a theory, that the Book of Mormon is a creation of Joseph Smith and possibly one or more additional fraudsters, each drawing on material and the social norms from the contemporary 19th century environment, rather than accepting the claim that it is in fact what Joseph said it is, a translation of an ancient record. Jonathan, through all your research and all that you've uncovered, which is, in my estimation, like I said, a mountain of information and evidence surrounding the events of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, you wrote those 10 books mentioned in your bio, which to me, as they said, is a small library in and of itself. And so I think it might be helpful for my viewers if you would share a little bit about each of one of those and why you wrote them, and they can get into your head a little bit, and you can then set the basis and set the table for what we're going to talk about. Do you mind sharing a little bit about? We'll start with Moroni's America.
Sure. Well, Moroni's America was, I think, the third or fourth one. I don't remember the order in which I wrote them. The first one that got me started on all this was called The Lost City of Zarahemla.
Yeah.
And the origin of that book was I had met a guy named Rod Meldrum. We had a mutual friend. And he told me if I wanted to understand more about the Native Americans and how they related to the Book of Mormon, I should go on a tour of Ohio. And as you mentioned in the bio, I've been all over the world, but I hadn't really spent much time in Ohio. So I thought, okay, I'll go on a tour. And it was really mind-blowing to see all these sites and museums in Ohio and the Midwest that relate to the Book of Mormon. And so I asked Rod, well, how did we ever get this idea that the Book of Mormon took place in Central America? And he said, well, it's because of these articles in the Times and Seasons, which was a newspaper, church newspaper in Nauvoo, Illinois, in the 1840s. And so, sure enough, I looked into it, and some excerpts from the Times and Seasons were even in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, and it said that the ruins in Central America were left by the Nephites, essentially. But when I looked it up in the actual Times and Seasons, all of these articles were anonymous. They weren't signed by anybody. It just said ED for editor. And, you know, it was unclear who the editor really was. I mean, Joseph Smith was named as the editor, but he was also named as the printer. And we all know he wasn't down there setting type and running the printing press, right? So he was a nominal printer. And I thought, well, what if he was just the nominal editor as well? He wasn't really actually doing any editing. And so I talked to Rod about this, and I approached it as a legal case to say, well, who actually wrote these articles? And that was my first book, The Lost City of Zarahemla. What I concluded, and it's a long whole episode if we wanted to get into that, was a guy named, a member of the church named Benjamin Winchester was the actual author of these articles, in conjunction with William Smith, who was the acting editor of the Times and Seasons. William Smith was Joseph's brother, and he was also editing a concurrent newspaper in Nauvoo called The Wasp. And some of the material in The Wasp and the Times and Seasons were identical. He would just take some of the material he had for The Wasp and put it in the Times and Seasons.
Kind of a cut and paste back in that time.
Yeah, well, they needed content, just like everybody needs content today, even, you know. But back then, he was printing The Wasp mainly for the people in Nauvoo, and then the Times and Seasons for the broader church, where they would mail it out. And I didn't think to bring copies of these to show, but The Wasp was a big broadsheet newspaper, whereas the Times and Seasons was a small little thing they could mail. About 5 by 7, let's say, that they could mail out with the newspapers.
A little mailer.
So they had two different purposes, but they had similar content. And we know William Smith was a publisher of The Wasp, and it was the Times and Seasons was printed on the same printing press and the same office and so on. So once I concluded that William Smith was the actual acting editor, possibly with the assistance of Phelps, who had come to Nauvoo by then, I realized, well, Joseph Smith never wrote these articles. It was all a mistake in church history to attribute these to Joseph Smith. And I published that book. I got lots of criticism from the
I
Meso.
bet you did.
Yeah, yeah, it was awesome. That's a whole fascinating story too, the tactics of the LDS apologists. But I thought, okay, well, I had a lot more information that I couldn't put in the book, so I published 2 additional books. One was called Brought to Light, and the other was called The Editors, where I talk about Joseph, Don Carlos, and William as editors of the different magazines.
Wow.
And part of the genesis of this was, when I first came across the Benjamin Winchester and found similarities in his other writings to these articles in the Times and Seasons, I called a friend of mine who was an emeritus general authority who had actually worked in the church history department. And I said, I've come across something. I need a sanity check on this.
Mm-hmm.
So he and one of his fellow emeritus general authorities came over to my house. I had about 25 pages of notes, so I went through all the evidence, and he was very enthusiastic about it. He says, well, this answers so many questions that we've always had about the origin of those articles and what was going on in the Times and Seasons.
Right.
And so that they encouraged me to publish the book. And actually, I met with Sherry Dew at Deseret Book, and she was interested in publishing it. She said she never believed that Joseph Smith could be the acting editor of the Times and Seasons, partly because
yeah,
he didn't have that aptitude. He wasn't interested in it. She even told me, I'm the editor and publisher at Deseret Book, and I don't have time to do this myself. I have an entire staff to do it.
yep.
So she never bought that he was the editor, but she also told me it would take 1.5 years or so to get through the correlation department because my findings were upending some long-held beliefs in the church history department.
Yes.
So I decided not to have her publish it, not to have Deseret Book publish it, because I knew also by the time you go through that correlation department, they take out all the stuff that is
You lose the
interesting to make it
control,
more
Jonathan.
bland.
You lose the control of the book.
Yeah. So we had it published by Boyd Tuttle, who owns Digital Legend Publishing. So those were my first 3 books, and I thought that, well, actually, the first book I thought would be the end of it, and then when the critics came out and made all kinds of claims that I could refute with additional information, I published the other 2 books. But then, getting back to Moroni's America that he asked me about, my wife said, well, if the Book of Mormon didn't take place in Central America, where did it take place? And she gave me a list of all the scriptures in the Book of Mormon dealing with geography, and that was the genesis of Moroni's America.
Wow. Okay, and the one I'm familiar with is the man that can translate, Joseph Smith and the
Yeah.
New Interpreters. That's a fabulous one, Jonathan.
Yeah, that was one where this whole idea of the stone in the hat has kind of somehow acquired almost a consensus among the scholars and historians that Joseph Smith didn't really ever translate anything. He just read words off a stone in a hat. And I thought, well, I wonder what the origin of that theory was and what the actual historical documents are. And so I did the same thing as I did with the Times and Seasons. I went back to the original historical references, most of them in the Joseph Smith papers, but there's also some in various newspapers that were published at the time, and in some of the writings and interviews of David Whitmer and Emma and so on. So I went through all that evidence, every reference I could find that anybody has ever cited, and concluded that, in fact, Joseph Smith translated with the Urim and Thummim, and he translated the plates. He wasn't just reading words off a stone in a hat. And that was also, of course, controversial, had plenty of critics among LDS apologists.
You're a controversial guy. You like to stir it up, huh?
I know, and I don't get that. I don't know why any of this is controversial because it's so obvious. That's the thing. And I ended up doing this book. You mentioned The Rational Restoration.
Right.
Which I think I have it here. Yeah, it looks like this. I did bring one of those. This one kind of summarizes all my other books.
Wow. Okay.
And the idea here is it's the subtitle is Reframes in the Pursuit of Clarity, Charity, and Understanding. Those are my 3 principles. And we can talk about those a little later, but anyone who's interested in knowing all the stuff I've been talking about and why it's controversial, this book summarizes it all.
Well, I
And
have a question in regard to that, and we'll
yeah,
probably get into a bit more of some of the questions I'm going to nail you with. I mean, come at you with. Just kidding.
sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
In that process, there's been this, and I don't want a long discussion, but I know you've taken the heat for it, so I'm curious what your thoughts are. You know, the church historian department and its history and the kind of academic folks that are in that, there's several schools. There's the old regular folks who believed what you've been, and then the new age modern type historians within the church even
Yeah.
kind of promote this. And it's almost like I'm not saying it is, I'm not judging, but it almost feels like that it's intentional to stir confusion and to kind of course and redirect the course of the church. I don't know, I just have had some real disheartening feelings, but I know my knower, when the tuning fork in there gets whacked and it boom, and I feel it so strong. I
Yeah.
just have not agreed with some of the things that the hats, you know, the what do you
Yeah.
call it? SITH, this the stone in
Sith.
the
Yeah.
hat theory just doesn't ring true to me. And so I know you're going to talk about that, and I just know the rest of these books really like letter 7. That's an interesting one that I've heard a little bit you
Yeah.
talked about.
Hmm.
As you would counsel us who look at these books, and you're encouraging us because I encourage people to get them, because it was really helps you see the more studied, straightforward resources, and what they said should eliminate that confusion and kind of clear up the dispelling the accusatory fog out there that has been thrown at, and some of the fog, quite frankly, has been put out there by some of the members of the church, and I just
Yeah.
find that a little disheartening.
Well, and it's understandable when you trace the origin of some of these things, because
Yeah.
what had happened is in the 1800s, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery confronted anti-Mormonists even before the Book of Mormon was published. And so they issued statements, published statements that were formalized and republished multiple times to dispel the fog, as you point out. And it had to do both with the origin and the setting of the Book of Mormon, both those two things. And one of them was the idea of the stone in the hat really originated in 1829 in Palmyra before the Book of Mormon was even published. And when Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon, he had a preface that was deleted after the 1830 edition. But right in the preface, he tried to dispel these rumors that had been circulating about how he produced the Book of Mormon. He explained, I translated the place, I translated the record. Well, I can't quote it exactly, but he said, I translated by the gift and power of God this record, which I took from the plates of Lehi. So he didn't say I took them off of a stone that I put in a hat.
No.
He specifically said right in that preface, he refuted that stone in the hat stuff by saying I took it from the plates of Lehi. And then later in 1834, there was this book called Mormonism Unveiled that kind of revived the stone in the hat theory.
That's quite a story behind that book, what took place.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and I have a blog we can give you for your readers to look
I was
at.
going to mention that. Are you the author or the overseer of the MOBOM, is what I call it, MOBOM?
Yeah.
You're the one that puts all that. Oh my goodness. It's going to be down in this description section. I'll put it in there because it's a place to go. So good,
Yeah.
Jonathan. So
Yeah.
helpful. So helpful.
There's a ton of material in there.
Oh man.
But I have another blog called LDS Historical Narratives. And in there, I go very specifically to discuss how these narratives are created and how they're perpetrated.
Yeah.
And for example, I talk about how the Joseph Smith papers themselves have implicit bias throughout, where they omit certain things to drive a narrative. And it's unfortunate because Joseph Smith papers are awesome.
It's so unfortunate. I hear you. I hear you.
I know, but the element of the Joseph Smith papers that provides the historical material is phenomenal. I mean, they've done a tremendous service for the entire world, especially for members of the church, to provide these materials. But then in their editorial content, they push these narratives. And I keep suggesting, well, it's not very academic to promote a narrative. You should present all the information.
All the information, both sides, 3 sides, 10 sides, whatever.
Exactly.
Can
And
you
so
give
far
that
they've resisted
to me?
that.
Can I put that in my description, the link of that one too?
Yeah, that's a good one.
That one to me, that'll be fabulous. That'll be fabulous.
Yeah, I think that one's really helpful, and it's been helpful for people to see it laid out from a faithful perspective, which is what I do, So But yeah, it is too bad that it was called the New Mormon History that started and a
Yes.
few decades ago, and what had happened is the church history compiled by Joseph Fielding Smith and other church historians have been kind of sanitized, and but there were other things that they didn't include, and partly because they didn't have access to as much information as we have today. But critics were always quoting David Whitmer and some of these other people about, say, the stone on the hat as an example. And so finally, a few decades ago, the church realized, the church leaders as well as historians realized that all this other information was going to come out on the internet. And so they started to incorporate it into the church history department to prepare the saints for this additional information.
Yeah.
Problem is that they kind of embraced it instead of pointing out why it was erroneous. So that's what happened essentially. So that's why the subtitle of that book you mentioned, well, the new book about by means of the Urim and Thummim, the subtitle is Restoring Translation to the Restoration, because we think that Joseph Smith actually did translate. And as we'll see in your as you ask more questions, many of the objections to the Book of Mormon are based on the assumption that Joseph Smith didn't translate it.
Right.
If you accept what he said, it's all easy to explain.
Well, I think that's a great lead in. You set the table. I hope you watching this can get a sense, because I was hoping this would do it. This man's got more in his brain. It's probably going to pop because it's got so much in there about this. And so I'm so happy to have you here, Jonathan. I've got some questions for you here.
Sure.
I did, as I was waiting to come on, I did want to, as far as translation, I went to a court case recently in the courthouse and sat in the audience and saw this woman who was there. She was brought in by the defendant to have a translator. And he had this on, and she was there. She understood English, was translating it into Spanish, and they call her an interpreter. It's interesting. Right. She would interpret the Spanish and what the gist was being said. I don't think it was a word for word because it goes so fast. And she then translated and gave her interpretation on it so this man could understand what was going on and hear and feel comfortable and give a good, honest answer back. To me, there's a lot in that little example about this topic of translation and what the world wants to make it mean. It's quite different. So anyhow, I'm going to read a few of these questions. There's a little lead in here. As you well know, Jonathan, the Book of Mormon, and it's coming forth in the way it did through the instrumentality of Joseph Smith, the prophet translator, interpreter, however you want to put that in there, seems to find little acceptance outside of the church's membership. And that's because so-called scholars realize that accepting the Book of Mormon's antiquity and historicity also means coming to terms with Eliot's beliefs about Joseph Smith's divine calling and his access to supernatural powers, such as visiting angels and heavenly visions of even God himself, as well as his son, Jesus Christ. Not to mention multiple ancient prophets like Moses, Elijah, John the Baptist, Peter, James, and John, and others. Joseph's and the Book of Mormon's critics also note that there has never been any physical proof of the existence of the golden plates themselves. And so, for those who are not members of the church and know very little on this topic that are watching this, let me mention that Joseph Smith said that the angel Moroni appeared to him and instructed him how to recover the plates. From where they were buried, Joseph said that Moroni then reclaimed the plates once Joseph completed their translation. And our critics say, well, how convenient. So the only thing the church has to back up Joseph Smith's claim regarding the reality of the plates are the eyewitnesses. There's actually 13, and that's not counting Mary Whitmer. That's from my point of view, and we'll talk about that. The 11 eyewitnesses support Joseph Smith's claim and are recorded in the Book of Mormon itself and are typically published at the beginning of the book, just inside its front cover. These two statements are known as the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses testimonies. While none of these men ever retracted their statements, critics nevertheless discount their testimonies for varying reasons. One such reason is they were all supposedly in on the come on, and they were mostly friends and family members of the prophet. So there's my lead in. Do you want to have anything to say about this overall arching criticism of the story of these 8 witnesses and how they're all part of the con?
Well, the debate about the witnesses has raged since the first publication of the Book of Mormon.
Recycled.
Yeah, and it's I don't know if you're familiar with what I call the faith model of analysis.
No, go ahead and share that with us.
I actually have a little chart that I keep here
Cool.
whenever I talk to people.
Absolutely.
I'll show you. It basically is an acronym for this, where there's facts, and then assumptions, inferences, theories, and hypotheses.
That's
And
excellent.
so
Faith.
everybody on all sides of every issue can agree to the facts. And most people resist that because they say, no, we don't. We have different facts. And I point out, well, we differ on our assumptions and inferences, not on the facts. And so in this case, the fact is that those 8 witnesses published a statement describing their experience. We can all
have
agree.
affidavits. They gave affidavits in a sense.
Essentially, yeah. And so we can all agree that on that fact. But then from there, we have assumptions. As Latter-day Saints, we assume that they told the truth. But as critics would say, they assume that they did not tell the truth. So the facts haven't changed. It's just our assumption about the fact.
Okay.
And then inferences and so on. So every one of these differences of opinion, if you go through the faith model, we're not arguing about facts. We're arguing about our assumptions, our different assumptions and inferences.
And interpretation fits in those assumptions, right? It's the same data, but there's 2 sides of interpreting what the story means or says.
Right. Just like in the Bible, there's times when some people said Christ had a devil, and other people said, well, he's the Son of God. They observed exactly the same things going on, but so the facts were the same, but they took 2 different assumptions or inferences from that.
Yeah.
So this is basic human nature. People have different assumptions based on their preconceived ideas and what they want to believe. So, anytime someone gets into this argument about, well, Martin Harris said it was a spiritual event, or, later on, David Whitmer said this about Joseph Smith, all that stuff. All that is feeding a narrative, but it doesn't change the fact that exists, that they made those statements. It's just a question of whether you want to believe them or not.
Well, you brought it up. In later years, Martin Harris, I have here, one of the eyewitnesses is recorded as having confessed that he saw the plates with spiritual eye or eye of faith. And therefore it infers, as you say, it was not in actuality. So you want to expand on that comment? Because this supposed statement from our enemies of the church, it constantly recycles over time. And here it is 200 plus years after, and they're still saying it out there when, in my mind, that's been refuted. But any thoughts of where we can go?
Well, it is a statement that's out there, but he also made many more literal statements. And so they've chosen one isolated statement that's hearsay anyway from Martin Harris, as opposed to all of his direct, adamant statements that reiterated or validated what he said in the beginning, which was that he saw the plates.
Yes.
And so it's another example of we have all the evidence in front of us, you can pick and choose which one you want to believe. So I look at all these things as, I don't mind critics saying whatever they want to say. I just want to make it clear that it's an assumption and an inference, not a fact.
That's true. And sometimes that even applies to us. It's not just their assumptions, we have assumptions. And that's what it comes down to. And I want to get this in before we go further. It does come down to the greatest witness, the greatest testimony is that of the Spirit, that of the Holy Ghost, that helps educate and inform our desires of the truthfulness of these things. So another accusation these so-called scholarly critics postulate, Jonathan, is that there's no evidence of a reformed Egyptian language, nor is there any archaeological evidence whatsoever to support the claim of the book's authenticity or its geographical placement. They say nothing has ever been discovered that supports our claims, and so in their view, the content found within the Book of Mormon has to be questioned.
Yeah. Well, on the Reformed Egyptian thing, we know from the text itself that the only records that survived were the ones that were in the repository in the Hill Cumorah, right? Because right from Omni at the very beginning, he explained that the Lamanites were intent on destroying their records. All the way through Moroni said the same thing at the very end, that if they got the records, they would destroy them all. That's why Mormon had to move all the records from the hill Shem to the hill Cumorah, because if the Lamanites had found them, they would have destroyed them. And there's parallels to that even in our modern day. If you remember, there was a time back when the Taliban was destroying all the Buddhist
Oh my
temples.
goodness, yes.
And that's a common thing. A conquering civilization or an army wants to destroy the language, the religion, the practices and culture of the people that they've
Even the memory
destroyed.
of it. Wasn't that true of Moses?
Yeah, yeah,
His own,
sure.
they got rid of the records of their
Yeah,
because they didn't like what he turned into and what he
yeah,
decided to do.
yeah.
Very interesting. Well, okay, let's continue.
Well, but
As you,
you also mentioned
yeah,
some things about the archaeology.
yes.
And so, but the first question to ask is, well, what do we expect to find? And when we read the Book of Mormon, there's no discussion in there about building any houses out of stone or building any pyramids or any massive civilization. It was all based on mounds of earth, it says, and they were building with wood, and for a period of time they were building with cement. And we find all those things in North America. In fact, some of the mounds were covered with cement so thick that they had to have jackhammers to break through it when they wanted to level them.
Yeah.
And so everything the Book of Mormon describes is actually found in North America. You can see it in museums across the Midwestern United States and in Western New York. And so this is why it's been frustrating for me to hear there's no archaeological evidence of the Book of Mormon when it's abundant.
Yep.
But it isn't if you think it took place in Central America, then it doesn't fit.
Well, we're going to get into that a little bit, and
Okay.
I appreciate because we're singing on the same sheet of music here.
Okay.
Well, very much so. As I'm sure you know, there are a few Latter-day Saint scholars who have provided archaeological findings that they say give credence to the book. Although mainstream scholars disagree with what they have already put forth, such as the altar of Nahum, you know about that one that's been discovered, the Battle Creek stone, and there are many more that I could list. I just want to make a point here for those watching. I say this often because I do hope you go and do it, but at Martin Braden Author, which is my YouTube channel, click on playlist. There's 33 categories. One of those categories is Book of Mormon evidence. There happens to be 432 videos in there, many of which I have of Jonathan Neville on that Book of Mormon evidence list of videos that cover, and if any, just even three, what I call legs of evidence, support legs of evidence. If there's only three per video, that's almost 1,300 legs that supports one's belief table, okay? And so you ought to check them out, take a notepad and write and just listen to those. I can accept that. You might find yourself with hundreds upon hundreds of support legs of evidence that your belief table can sit on it. And I just say that do that because there's so much evidence. If you just take the time to research. I mean, I don't know if you can take the 30, 40 years that Jonathan's done and digging in all the resources and primary sources and having friends all over the map that can help and direct, but you can do your own research and find some of these answers. Just don't be so quick to follow what the naysayers say. I suggest you view those videos, take notes, and then determine for yourself through prayer what you believe. Of what you feel these bits of evidence, what story they say. That said, these past and present scholars vehemently reject Joseph Smith's explanation of the origin of the Book of Mormon. As far as the Reformed Egyptian language is concerned, Joseph Jr. said that the text contained within the Book of Mormon was derived from an ancient Native American record written on golden plates by ancient prophets. Joseph Smith also said that God gave him the power to translate it into English by the gift and power of God. This issue of translation from Reformed Egyptian is real, and so there are several specific issues with Joseph's claim. And I know you know that because you've written a co-authored or something with the book that deals very much so in this topic of translation and King James Version that Joseph seemed to have copied. I'm just curious some of your thoughts on that because you wrote a whole book. What stands out to you that would really be helpful for us when we're maybe wrestling with that?
Well, there's the list of objections about the translation, for example, that he quote unquote plagiarized the King James Version, and he used a specific edition, those types of things. To me, it's an assumption that Joseph didn't really translate the Book of Mormon because
what he's saying.
if he did translate it, then he was familiar with the Bible. In fact, he even said that in his own history that he searched the scriptures from the age of 12 to 15 and even before that. And so he was very familiar with the biblical language. As well, he said he had an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations, which I think meant he was familiar with Christian writings of the time. And I've talked about this a lot, that we've kind of had a misunderstanding of Joseph Smith's youth, because there's been two narratives out there that I think, and I talk about this in the Rational Restoration book. The two narratives were that Joseph Smith was either an ignorant farm boy that was illiterate that God just appeared to when he said a prayer, or that Joseph Smith was a conniving, brilliant guy who concocted this whole thing. And both of those narratives aren't plausible to me. And so, but what is plausible is what Joseph Smith himself said. When he was asked about the restoration of the gospel, he said, well, it started when I was around 6 years old, which means when he had the leg surgery.
Correct.
And because of the leg surgery, he was laid up for several years where he was on crutches or had to be carried. So he had nothing to do but to read. And he said that his parents spared no effort in educating him in the Christian religion. And he had this intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations. So he was very familiar with Christian literature. He pondered about it. He studied it out in his mind and all this long before he ever had the first vision. And certainly before Moroni's visit. So when it came time, in my view, I see this leg surgery and his upbringing as the Lord preparing him to be the translator and the prophet, eventually the prophet. And so when he actually translated the plates, he was incorporating the language that was in his mind, what I call his mental language bank, which is the same process we all do. I don't know if you've translated things. I've translated things into French, and I can only use the French language that I'm familiar with in the process of translation. And so that's how Joseph Smith was too. He knew English, he knew the vocabulary of Christianity, he knew the concepts and principles. And that's why we find examples of biblical language as well as the writings of Jonathan Edwards and other Christian ministers and authors in the Book of Mormon. That's what we would expect. Now, the critics will say, well, there's anachronisms in there, there's evidence of plagiarism, which is all kind of a ridiculous objection if Joseph really was a translator. I like to say any evidence of composition is also evidence of translation, because that's the nature of how we do things.
Yes, it is.
And you know, it's funny to me that the critics came up with start promoting the stone in the hat theory, which is the idea that Joseph just read the words off a stone, didn't really translate anything. What's that?
Prophet, seer, and reader.
Yeah, prophet, seer,
Not translator.
So, but this, what I call the stone in the hat, the Sith theory,
Yeah.
is that he was just reading words that appeared on a stone. And in that scenario, yeah, we would expect the book to be perfect. It would have been, you know, divinely translated by what I call the mist, the mysterious, incognito, supernatural translator who actually translated, put the words on the stone. Then the critics have a point. It shouldn't have anachronisms and all these other things if it was stone in the hat. But if Joseph was the translator, like he said, then we would expect anachronisms because he could only put it in his worldview as a translator. So a lot of the objections just fade away if you accept what Joseph Smith said, that he translated it. And we could go through specific details if you want, but I think it's important for people to realize that what a lot of these critics in the CES letter and other things are saying is based on the assumption that Joseph Smith didn't translate it.
That's right. And that takes you down a whole different rat hole. I've got a little thing I wrote out because it was a thought, because it's relating to my next little question here. Let me get to that. Let's see. It's called, what's that term called? Oh, I know where it is. It's right here at the very end. I came across this and heard about it, and I just think that it's very fascinating to me. If I can find it, I apologize. I should have had it right here, because it's the actual wording that I think fascinating, and that is right here, I think. Yeah. DNA of indigenous Native Americans. The academics can't find any Hebrew DNA in them. but I heard of some information from a Dr. Stephen Jett, mitochondrial DNA from Middle Eastern sources, and mitochondrial DNA only transmits through the female lineage, so males can't even pass it on. He says, so, but there is however, what's called human leukocyte and antigens, which is HLA. That is pretty specific, special blood markers that shows where someone comes originally. And there is clusters in North America that shows from the Middle East, the Hebrew, what that's HLAs show there. And I just thought maybe you haven't talked about that. To me, this DNA thing always became a concern to me, because I know we still have a long ways to go. And just all of a sudden they jump out and say, okay, DNA doesn't show Hebrew, but that's not the full story, I guess is what I'm saying, especially when you're dealing with 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. I mean, the Jaredites are 2,500 or 2,300 BC. What's going to show up after all those many thousands of generations? Just thoughts on that, John.
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is we have no idea about the DNA of the Jaredites.
Correct.
And this leads into an interesting discussion, I think, about the Jaredites, because there's always been this assumption that the Book of Ether talks about all of the Jaredites. But the very first verse, Moroni says he's talking about the people in this North Country.
That's right.
Meaning around Cumorah, where he wrote the Book of Ether. And so that leaves the whole rest of the continent open for descendants of the Jaredites to have lived there. And so my own interpretation is that Ether was talking about his own family line, which was, after 33 plus generations, a fairly small branch of the entire group of Jaredites.
Yep.
And so in my own view, there were Jaredite DNA, which was Asian, because they crossed Asia, presumably to the west coast or the east coast of China before crossing the Pacific, is how I see it. And there's Native American traditions in British Columbia that validate all that, which I've written about in Moroni's America. But so the Asian DNA would have come from Jaredites, but the Book of Mormon never says no one else came over here either. Even Joseph Smith never said no one else ever came. So there's plenty of room within the context of the Book of Mormon for lots of other people living in the Americas.
A lot of migrations, a lot of exoduses of births for the centuries, absolutely.
Exactly. So then with regard to Lehi coming over, landing in my view, and probably along the panhandle of Florida, there are also indigenous people there. We know that because of archaeology, but they were not organized into nations. They were not high in numbers. They were basically hunter-gatherers. And so from my reading of the text, when Nephi left his brothers, he took his family and those who would go with him, which would be indigenous people who had kind of assimilated. And they went up into Tennessee and then eventually out to Illinois and so on. But so their DNA they were already intermarrying with people. And when they say they were a direct descendant of Lehi, I think Mormon said that later on, that doesn't mean that he didn't have other ancestry as well, right?
Correct. There's more in his bloodline, that's right.
Sure. And so the DNA issue, I think, has been pretty well articulated in the church's essay on that, where you have the bottleneck problem.
Right.
That's one of the issues. The other issue is the whole timing and the assumption on how quickly DNA mutates in human populations. And that's a scientific discussion that people have debated over.
But I just know it was a period of time, it was a big flash, and but
yeah,
lots happened since then. And
but again, this is an example of where the assumptions were this, not the facts. It was based on assumptions. And people assumed that because Moroni told Joseph that they were the literal descendants of the House of Israel, that they would have purely Israelite blood. But that's not the case. And even in the Wentworth letter, Joseph Smith made that distinction. You're bringing
that list of faith and this assumptions on how that truly can tilt things. And so that's great. There's not an order of these things. I'm just running through here.
Sure.
The last Battle of Cumorah, the supposed nearly 2 million casualties with nothing left to show that it took place, that's thrown at us. What's your thoughts on that, Jonathan?
Yeah, that's a funny one, because even in BYU studies, they have a chart, these Book of Mormon charts, And it shows in there that there were 2 million people killed at Cumorah. And every time I read that, I laugh. It's like, did you guys not read the text itself? And I think the problem is that the heading to Ether says 2 million people killed in battle. And people assume from that that it was referring to Cumorah, but that's not what the book says. His Coriantumr actually says that he thought about what Ether had told him about the prophecies, and he realized that 2 million of his people, men and I guess, and their wives on top of that, but 2 millions have been killed in battle. Well, but he's reflecting back over their entire history.
That's what I was thinking. A couple thousand years plus or whatever.
Yeah, well, 33 generations and more, actually. And I once calculated it out. It adds up to a few thousand a year, which is not that many really, but over that many generations, it's a lot of people. And the analogy is we say that over 1 million Americans have died in battle, but that's since the Revolutionary War. There's been the Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War I, World War II, etc.
Back to the assumptions. Back to the assumptions.
Yeah.
What we start with.
Well, but even worse. So Coriantumr has this recollection of 2 million being killed. And after that, it's several years later that they get to the final battle at Cumorah, or which they called Ramah. And so there was never any indication in the text that 2 million people were killed at the final battle.
Correct.
I tried to figure out where that originally came from, and I haven't found it, because when Oliver Cowdery wrote Letter 7, he said there were thousands of Jaredites is all, not even 10,000.
And proof of that is so much easier to find in this northeast.
Well, of course.
But 2 million, that's a lot of bones. That's a lot of But
so
whatever. But what about the 10,000 and the 10,000 and the 10,000 of Moroni's leadership?
Okay.
What about that thought? People kind of conflate that.
Yeah, they conflate that too, because if you read actually Mormon chapter 6 talks about all this. He says my 10,000 and Moroni's 10,000. Well, 10,000 was not an enumerated number. It wasn't a specific number. He wouldn't have said 9,986 if that's how many were left. It was a military unit. And there's precedent for that all over the world, where military units were a number of people. And in this case, 10,000. And it may have started off as 10,000. And then by the time they got to Cumorah, there could have been half that or even fewer, but it was still called a 10,000 unit. Just like a battalion.
My understanding is kind of like you bring your 10,000, I'll bring my 10,000, and we'll go at it. But it's not 10,000. It's just trying to project a strength, or that people who are cheering David and his 10,000 followed him and only 50 followed. But it wasn't 10,000. It was just trying to exaggerate and blow up the number. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, maybe it may have started off as 10,000.
Okay.
But then as a unit, an army. But the largest enumerated army in the whole Book of Mormon is only like 40,000.
Right.
I think there was one time a Lamanite army of 50,000. But if you read through the Book of Mormon, Mormon's book, meaning not the whole Book of Mormon, but he says there that he had 40,000 against 42,000. I don't have all the numbers in front of me. But after they gathered their people together, they only had 40,000 people. And this was before the retreat to New York, back when they were still in Ohio and maybe part of Pennsylvania. And so they were being decimated as they went. By the time they got to Cumorah, there were only two units of 10,000 each, which was Mormons and Moronites were the only ones left. It's the only ones he said he could see from the hill Cumorah. Then he listed off another 23, I think it was 23, of his generals and their 10,000 who had been killed.
Right.
But again, this is like Coriantumr. He was reflecting back to the time when he first became a general.
Okay.
So
they had a lot of battles for a lot of years.
Yeah, totally. And so he's over these years with the fights with the Lamanites when they were in retreat, all his previous armies had been killed off and decimated. And so he's reflecting on all of them and naming some of the leaders and so on. Doesn't mean there are 230,000.
Somehow condense it into a little 60 or 90-day war period for something in our head. They had this last battle, and so all these 2 million people were over here and over there. Yeah. It's just not how it's laid out in the Book of Mormon, within the Book of Mormon. It's just not, but we conflate, and that's human nature, I suppose, especially when you have a critical eye and you want to see, I told you, that's really what's happening here.
Well, and again, like I say, I've tried to trace where that 2 million dying at Cumorah started, and I haven't been able to find it yet. But I know the Meso proponents are down there in southern Mexico looking for a big mountain because they think it has to have 2 million people killed. And it's ludicrous. I mean,
Of course,
I just
when
don't
you
get
don't
it.
start out with the right thing to assumption to go find
Yeah,
something, you're not going
that's
to
right.
find it, of course. I want to
Yeah.
jump to this Cumorah because we talked about the Cumorah and the battle and
Okay.
people say,
Sure.
just a little question. It says, ex-Latter-day Saint Grant H. Palmer suggested that Smith borrowed the name Cumorah through his study of the treasure hunting stories of Captain William Kidd, Moroni and Cumorah, to the location Moroni, Comoros, really to Kidd's hunt for the treasure. What about
Right.
this two Comoras or this story of Comoros? What's your research found you?
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple of things to there. First off, you can find name analogies all around the world if you look for them. So as far as the Captain Kidd thing, to me, that's purely a coincidence. But it turns out years ago, I used to live in Africa, and we went over to Comoros, the country of Comoros, and went to the capital of Moroni, right there. And I've researched as much as I could into the origins of those names, and it's lost in history. No one really knows exactly where it came from or how ancient those names are. But it is along the route that Lehi took from, that I think anyway, that Lehi took from the Arabian Peninsula to America, because he went down the east coast of Africa. And from a distance in the ocean, you could see Comoros. It's a big volcano on that island, and it's very prominent. And especially if it's active, at night it would light up. So it makes sense to me that Lehi would have stopped there. He could have been on the coast of Africa or off the coast, landing at this island. And if it was an ancient name, he could have picked it up. But again, that's highly speculative because who knows? There's no way to verify it from history. There's no written records going back that far. So that's one possibility. But the idea that Joseph borrowed it from the Captain Kidd story doesn't make any sense because it wasn't the Cumorah that Captain Kidd wrote about was not the scene of a final battle. It was not, the capital of Moroni had nothing to do with an angel. I mean, it's just a pure coincidence is how I look at it.
Well, I do have a question then. It's the next one that seems to be a retread that comes out a lot. I want your insight, Jonathan, on the treasure digger. Smith was known as a treasure hunter long before he found the golden plates.
Right.
And so it muddles up what he truly did and not. And I will hold off on my opinion right now, and I'm going to let you share your thoughts that you've searched. I know you researched this. So I'm curious.
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, Oliver Cowdery, Joseph Smith, and Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph's mother, all discussed this. And they said, yeah, he was involved with that, but it was highly exaggerated from the things that his critics said, the affidavits in Mormonism Unveiled, for example. They grossly exaggerated his involvement with that. And he had other friends in Palmyra that were engaged in the same activity who were talking about his involvement with it. But he, like Joseph's kind of made light of it. He said, yeah, I was a treasure digger and I didn't earn much money for it. I don't remember the amount that he said. Oliver Cowdery said, yeah, if you believe the critics, he dug up half the mountains in Pennsylvania, and his mother even kind of ridiculed the whole idea because it really was an insignificant aspect of his life, his early life. So I just see it as I don't know how many of his peers were engaged in that kind of activity, but apparently a lot of them were. There's the kind of thing that what does a kid do in the afternoon when he's done farming? He goes out and digs for treasure. That was pretty common.
Well, today in our time, we have our late teens, early 20 folks that are doing the cell phone betting online. They go and these first 200 bucks free, and you do this, bet this on the sports games.
Sure.
Does that mean that every one of them are corrupt bettors and into the dark world of making illegal bets? It
Yeah.
just we take it in our time and match it up. I think that was just kind of an activity during that time. And as a child, I would go digging for treasures. I'd go looking because I'd seen these guys with these metal detectors and beep beep. And I just thought, I can't afford that, but I can go maybe I can find myself a silver dollar or whatever. But that doesn't make me a treasure digger.
Well, here,
yeah.
I live at the beach here in Oregon, and we see people out here with their metal detectors all the time. And even when I was a kid, I remember I lived in the Philippines, And my friends and I thought we could dig underground tunnels to connect our houses. That's how naive we were. So we were digging holes. One time we dug this deep hole and a water buffalo fell in it, which was a big disaster for us. So we had to dig that thing out. We had to dig a ramp so it could get out because we could have gotten in a lot of trouble if it got injured in there.
That's wild.
So kids digging treasure is about the most common activity you can think of, at least that I know of.
That time, yep. Well, I'm going to read
Well,
this
even today, yeah.
Book of Mormon Theology. Early critic of Mormonism and contemporary of Joseph Smith, Reverend Alexander Campbell, noted the Book of Mormon contains many theological answers to hotly debated questions from the 19th century Americans' theology. He stated the following: the prophet Joseph Smith, through his stone spectacles, wrote on the plates of Nephi in his Book of Mormon every error and almost every truth discussed in New York for the last 10 years, was his claim. He decides all the great controversies: infant baptism, ordination, the Trinity, generation, repentance, justification, the fall of man, the atonement, transubstantiation, fasting, penance, church government, religious experience, the call to the ministry, the general resurrection, eternal punishment, who may baptize, and even the question of Freemasonry, republican government, and the rights of man. Campbell argued the presence of these topics represented a contemporary author rather than multiple authors writing in antiquity. Grant Palmer also argued that the Book of Mormon reflects a keen awareness of evangelical Protestantism and the Bible, noting similarities in language and theme to the 19th century. I can't see, I've read it several times. I don't see the rub. I don't understand. Of course he'd know about Protestantism. Of course he'd know about the evangelical movement and the burnout district and all that stuff. But this other, having all that topics, he doesn't feel that the Lord teaches the same principles of government from Adam's time to us. That's what he's basically implying. But he had beautiful comments about the Constitution in the Book of Mormon. The Lord did, revealed those prophets, and then the DNC and so forth. What's your thought on this supposed critic?
Okay, there's two parts of it. First part is Alexander Campbell included a lot of things that are not in the Book of Mormon. And Royal Skousen has pointed that out, that in his list of things, there's some things in there that the Book of Mormon doesn't address, which indicates that maybe he didn't really read it, or he read things into it that weren't there. So that's the first point. The second point is that, well, I guess there's 3 points. The second point is that Joseph Smith was, as we've talked about, the translator. So naturally, he would put it in words that he was familiar with and concepts. He said he had an intimate acquaintance with those of different denominations. So he, right up front in his first history, he said he was familiar with these issues. So as he translated the ancient text, he would frame it, you could say interpret it, to apply to the language and the concepts in his society. The third point is that critics like Alexander Campbell and the others just assumed that people anciently didn't have the same issues. And that's just a bald assumption, because, you know, human nature seems to be fairly consistent over the years, right? And so people have questions about God and you know, salvation and all these kind of things in lots of different cultures. And to just simply assume that because we don't have a record of it, the ancient people in North America could not have been concerned about these issues is ridiculous. You know, it's, people can have that assumption if they want, but they have to recognize it's an assumption, it's not a fact, just like we talked about earlier.
Well, I find it very interesting. You know of a murder case, and these scientific forensic scientists come in and they take as much evidence they can from the scene, and then they have these investigators go out and talk to tons and tons and tons of people. And the hardest thing is you cannot replicate history exactly.
Right.
And especially one that's history's 200 years old or 10,000 years old. You can't replicate it. And so these folks, as best educated as they can with all their training of being skeptical and looking, they still have to interpret and then come up with their own story. And I feel that we're basically applying this principle of interpretation and of assumptions, because the investigators have to assume certain things to hopefully dig up and find where they should go look. And so I don't criticize people for assuming some things, but I do criticize when they take an assumption and they have no primary resources or sources to back it up, yet they hold to it. And so I find that there's plenty of evidence for the Book of Mormon, for he who has eyes to see, and add it all up, there is far more there moving that spectrum of that marker of faith along the spectrum towards Book of Mormon's true, as opposed to it's a false a book.
Right.
These proofs move it along, and then I guess if you hold fast, you can always go in there and say, I don't want to look at anything else. So that's an interesting. Another one of those critics talks about revisions. Critics also challenge the divine origin of the Book of Mormon by noting the numerous revisions that have been made to the text. Though most challenges, let me get this something of it. Most changes are small spelling and grammar corrections. Critics claim that even these are significant in the light of Smith's so-called divine inspiration. In other words, if it's divine and it's the finger of God in a sense writing it, should be no mistakes. He should not have any edits. What's your thoughts on this assumptive view?
That gets back to the Sith thing. If he read the words off a stone, then I would agree with the critics. He shouldn't be changing it. But if he actually translated it, then, in fact, in the 1840 edition that he revised, right on the cover, it says carefully revised by the translator, which is what a translator should do. You know, as he acquired more understanding of English grammar and maybe spelling and so on, he changed some of the grammar that he had originally dictated. But he said right there, carefully revised by the translator. I mean, I don't know how more clear he could have been by saying that. He was the translator and he revised it. That's natural. You know, I've translated some of my books into French, and I've gone back and revised the translation in many cases because I could see how it wasn't as clear. Even in France, for example, John Taylor and another guy translated the Book of Mormon, I think, in the 1850s, and it's been carefully revised since then, actually completely revised since then. And many of the early translations of the Book of Mormon in other languages have been revised later, just because they realize that the translation was incorrect or needed to be improved.
I find it interesting. I've only written one book. I'm an author, I suppose, because I don't know if I qualify for just one book matched up to what you've done. But it's 385,000 words, and I stopped counting at 50 rewrites. I mean, for 2.5 years, and it's still doing one last little rewrite and still finding misspelled words. And I'm just saying, to hold that kind of standard up to the world, it just proves none of them wrote a book. Now, let alone none of them translated the book into something else. It's just mind-boggling to me that they can be ignorant with these challenges and these critics.
Well, but I mean, to play a little devil's advocate there, if the narrative is that Joseph read the words word for word off the stone, then he shouldn't have made revisions.
That I agree with.
Yeah. So to the extent that our scholars are teaching that, then the critics have a good point, which is again one of the fallacies of even promoting the Sith narrative.
I have a word that I'm not real good at, but I suspect you know what this is, Jonathan. Okay. It's the deuterocanonical books. Does that sound
right?
Did I say that really well? The Deuteronomy canonical books, it's talking about Deuteronomy, I suppose, which Joseph Smith's Bible had as well, is referred to in the Book of Mormon. Furthermore, the language of the Book of Mormon closely mimics the Elizabethan English used in the 16th century King James Version with 19th century English mixed into it. The Book of Mormon quotes 25,000 words from the King James Old Testament, and he talks about Nephi and Isaiah, and over 2,000 words from the King James Version New Testament. There are numerous cases where the Nephite writers mimic wording from the New Testament, a document to which they would have had no access. Below are 5 examples out of a list of 400 examples created by Gerald and Sandra. I'm not going to show that. I know what you're going to say. You've taught me here. Very simply, that's a big comment, but it comes down to how you viewed, if it was not translated by Joseph, then yeah. But if it was, and how he translated it by interpreting and not a word for word, which is, I guess, the long view, then it completely blows that whole argument right out.
Yeah, first off, they say the Nephite writers were quoting the New Testament. That's absurd. He didn't quote it. The only thing Joseph Smith said was a literal translation was the title page. Everything else was his translation. So the Nephite writers did not quote Paul. Joseph Smith quoted Paul when he was translating the Nephite text. And, I did a a little experiment. I took one of the critics' articles, and I Googled the different phrases and found all the origins of those phrases.
Yeah.
And I could make the argument that they plagiarized these original sources when it's just a common language. You know, the only reason we can even communicate is we have a common language where we have words that we both understand.
Correct.
It's not just words, it's words and phrases and concepts. And so anytime you write something or say something, you're using what we call chunks of language, which is like a phrase or a repeated pattern. And when Joseph translated it, naturally he used those chunks of language that he had acquired by studying the Bible and the works of these other writers. You know, one of my books is all about the influence of Jonathan Edwards on Joseph Smith. And I've actually annotated chapters of the Book of Mormon so you can see which parts were from the Bible, the Old and New Testament, which parts were from the works of Jonathan Edwards, and which are original to the Book of Mormon that you don't find outside the Book of Mormon. And you can see how, just like any of us writing something, you can see how Joseph Smith was drawing on his familiarity with these
What was
previous
mapping in his
sources.
head from what he's learned
Yeah,
already.
totally. Yeah.
Wow.
So I would tell the critics, let's see if you can write anything that hasn't been written before. And you can't, because it's a common language. If you wrote something that hadn't been written before, no one else would understand it.
Yeah.
So
I guess
mean,
in
some of
some
these
way we're all
arguments
plagiarists because we have sentences here and
yeah,
thoughts there, somebody has, and we put
exactly.
it and we use it in our language. We're all
Yeah,
plagiarists in that sense.
yeah, yeah.
And I guess somebody could criticize. Abraham Lincoln said that, Marty, and George Washington said that about this.
Yeah,
All plagiarists, but that's just an accumulation of our life communicating with
exactly.
people like this. And that's really what you're saying here.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right.
Well, critics believe Joseph Smith came up with all the names in the Book of Mormon, noting that Joseph owned a King James Bible with a table listings all the names used in the Bible. Many Book of Mormon names are either biblical, formed from a rhythmine pattern, or changed by a prefix or suffix. Furthermore, Jaredites and the Nephites shared names, despite the Jaredites being of a different place and language than the Nephites. One possible explanation for the cross-pollination, it's called, is that Nephites incorporated the people of Zarahemla into their polity, which is said to have briefly coexisted in time and place with the Jaredites. So did Joseph just kind of pull from his surrounding couple 300 miles around him all the words, names? Is that how that happened?
Yeah, well, this is another example of the coincidence thing with the Cumorah.
Yeah.
But I guess there's three ways to approach this too. First off, they write it according to the Book of Mormon itself. They were Hebrew. So you would expect biblical names in there just by the nature of the culture.
Yep.
The second thing is that this gets back to the Jaredite issue. If we assume all the Jaredites died at the hill Ramah, then yeah, you wouldn't expect to have Jaredite names among the Nephites. But if instead, Moroni was only talking about the ones living in this north country around Palmyra, and the Jaredite culture had persisted throughout the Americas otherwise, then the Nephites, when they met up with the people of Zarahemla or even otherwise, would have encountered those people, intermarried, and adopted some of their names.
Sure.
And then the people of Zarahemla themselves, they didn't have a written language, and so they would modify the names that they had by maybe changing a suffix or changing a few things. And so we know that they didn't have the written record to keep the names exactly the same all the time. And so those criticisms that you just read actually support the narrative in the Book of Mormon.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
It doesn't
I know.
challenge it, it affirms it.
Yeah, and they are transliterated too. So, you know, we don't know exactly how it read on the original place, but Joseph had to transliterate it into English letters. And then when we read it, might not sound exactly the same. It's like when I lived in China, you had Chinese names. Well, a perfect example is how we changed Peking, which is the capital of China when I grew up, and now it's Beijing, because Peking was how early, I guess, the English were pronouncing the Chinese word. And then after a while, they realized, well, Beijing is closer to the way the Chinese pronounce it, so they changed it in English.
That's
But it's the same word.
Well, but they changed it. Something's not right there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's transliterated differently into English. So
Well, another fun one, this is interesting, the misogyny criticism. The
Yeah,
Book of Mormon has been criticized for its lack of significant female characters in its narrative. In the Old
yeah.
Testament, male pronouns he and she, his are mentioned 6.5 times more than female pronouns she and her. But in the Book of Mormon, the ratio is 31 times more often. And in the small plates of Nephi, it is 46 times more often. Only 6 female characters are explicitly named in the Book of Mormon: Sariah, the wife of Lehi; Abish, the Lamanitish woman; Isabel, the harlot; Eve, Sarah, and Mary, compared to 188 in the Bible. No woman except perhaps the wife of King Lamoni in the Book of Mormon is portrayed as having her own independent connection with heaven. Now, there may be some legitimate criticism, but I'm not sure the purpose of this was to create a full balance, but I'm interested in what your thought is.
Well, there's a lot of thoughts I have. First off, so what is my first response. But when you realize if Mormon was the person who abridged it, and I've been interested in this. I don't know if anybody's actually gone through and figured out how much of the text was written by Mormon versus how much was original writings.
I remember seeing a chart that showed all the authors, like 32 of them, and what percentage who did what. And Mormon
Yeah.
was quite a number 1 or 2 or 3 in there. Yeah, I've seen a chart on that.
But he was abridging the records of the prophets, which were all male for the most part, right?
There you go.
And he was talking about the war, which involved men primarily. And, large sections of the Book of Mormon talk about the wars. And in the books of First and Second Nephi, a lot of us quoted from Isaiah. So I don't know why there would be an expectation that an ancient book written by a warrior, a general, or a captain in an army would be talking a lot about women. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, I understand and appreciate the criticism. I really do, because the women of faith and the women in the world are vital to this world's history. They're
Oh
magnificent.
yeah, absolutely.
But in this case, you could hold up, and I'll just grant them the criticism. Don't know why, because I don't think it was intentional. And it kind of leans like it's trying to put forth that it was intentional. It shows a misogynistic type personality. Anyhow, racism. The Book of Mormon racial hermeneutics equates whiteness with righteousness, civilization, and Christianity. It defines blackness as heathenism, apostasy, and slavery. That's not true. That's not true, but
Yeah.
I understand why the critics would bring it up because it's quite divisive, but it's just not true when you really dig into it. I'm curious, have you spent much time on that particular criticism?
Not really. I've seen lots of articles trying to explain the skin of blackness in different
Yeah.
ways, whether it's metaphorical, whether it's a spiritual skin, those types of arguments. I've seen lots of those.
Well, no, it
Oliver
has to be
Cowdery,
something different, Jonathan, because the Lord himself in the Book of Mormon and what Joseph said
yeah,
that black, white, race
right,
is all. And so if that's the Lord's foundational point, then when we're
right,
looking at the other things wrong, if we
yeah,
apply to it racism, because he's not racist.
sure.
That's just my thought.
Well, and Oliver Cowdery pointed out that, there had been a narrative that there was this white race that was destroyed by the darker race in ancient America. And he said that isn't how it was, because the Nephites and the Lamanites were all combined.
Mixed, yeah. It was just
There
the
was
title,
no,
wasn't the type of skin, people.
yeah, and they were both wicked. So it wasn't the righteous were destroyed by the wicked, they were both wicked. So these issues have floated around since the beginning. And, again, people can read into it whatever they want.
It goes back to
But
the assumptions.
yeah, okay.
It
Fair
really
enough.
does.
Yeah,
Population size. Critics challenge the viability of the population size
yeah,
growth of the Book of
yeah.
Mormon people. M.T. Lamb was perhaps the first to suggest that the Book of Mormon has an unrealistic population growth rate. Modern studies, he says, on population size and growth have been done by John Kunitz. Kunitz's analysis agrees with Lamb's that the Book of Mormon presents an unrealistic growth rate for the population.
Well, that's what we talked about earlier, that there were people here. It's just Lehi said there would be no nations. He didn't say there'd be no people. And that the distinction there is significant because there were nations in parts of the Americas, particularly in Central America and South America. But in North America, it was primarily hunter-gatherers. And so the hunter-gatherer civilizations were still present, and they account for why the numbers in the Book of Mormon seem to increase rapidly, faster than the natural rate of birth. And so that all makes sense, but they still were not huge numbers. And again, this gets back to the idea of millions of Jaredites. If there were millions of Jaredites killed over 33 generations, that's a completely different narrative than if there were millions killed in one battle. And so that's why I looked at how big were the actual armies that we know that they had. And again, like I said, the biggest one was 42,000. There's one that was 50,000 from the Lamanites, but those were not big armies with millions of people. And so I think some people have way overestimated how large the Nephite population was.
This is going to jump off that. I appreciate that. Now, hopefully this is helping those folks who are hit with these questions. They have at least an answer to go to, and that's great. Chiasms, supporters of the Book of Mormon say it uses chiasmus or other Hebraisms. Chiasm is a figurative speech utilizing inverted parallelism. Then Latter-day Saints point to it as evidence supporting the book's ancient origin. Critics such as Gerald and Sandra Tanner, Gerald is passed, but Sandra Tanner argued that chiasmus in the Book of Mormon is a characteristic of Joseph Smith's speech pattern. He's a brilliant guy then, if that's what it is, and not evidence of antiquity. They cite the use of chiasmus in the Doctrine and Covenants, which was not translated from an ancient text, as evidence. Scholar D. Michael Quinn argues that chiasmus was publicly known in Joseph Smith's environs. He suggests that there was 2 books describing that chiasmus were available in the Palmyra bookstore and advertised for sale, so that's where he got it from. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, definitely the Hebrew parallelism was well known in Joseph Smith's time. Jonathan Edwards talked about it, for example, and implemented it, but the Bible does too. I mean, the Bible has, even sayings of Christ had inverted parallelism. And so it was not as, I guess I'm saying it cuts both ways, because on the one hand, the critics are correct. It was not a secret that Hebrews used inverted parallelism. It wasn't called chiasmus in Joseph Smith's day, but it had other terms, but it was recognized as a thing. And it's a natural way of speaking anyway. Anytime we, critics have given lots of examples in normal speech, how we say something and then reverse it in the opposite order in a parallel form. But on the other hand, some of the ones in the Book of Mormon are very sophisticated. It took a lot of effort to kind of plan out to make sure that the fulcrum was the most important point and so on. And that indicates an ancient text, that it was carefully edited and composed to create this chiastic format that makes it easier for people to remember when they repeat it verbally as opposed to in text. So, on the one hand, I think the critics have a good point that this was not a mysterious thing that no one knew about. But on the other hand, the evidence of it in the Book of Mormon is more sophisticated than someone composing it would have come up with.
Well, Jonathan, with the last 9 or 10 minutes we have, I just want you to, with this Dispelling the Accusatory Fog in your mind and what all you've done and written and studied, what are some last moment thoughts that you have that you'd like to share towards those who might have some cognitive dissonance or are concerned, enjoyed you so far, but what bears on your heart right now that you'd like to tell them, the things that you know and you've discovered?
Okay. The first point I'd say is that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery told the truth. What they said makes sense and is corroborated by external evidence. And I've written plenty of material. Anyone who wants can look on the website that you mentioned, MoBOM, or the other websites or the books or the podcast, all the different ways I've tried to explain this. Yep. So that's very simple. The second point is that some LDS scholars have veered away from what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery taught. In their sophistication with their credentials, for whatever reason, they've decided that Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, some of them even say they deliberately misled Latter-day Saints, but they've kind of veered off into left field on the origin and setting of the Book of Mormon. And as a result, they've kind of created this massive confusion that people feel. And in my view, it's better to go to the original source. Don't look at what the scholars say about the original source. Go to the original source. What did Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery say about these things? And if you believe what they said, then it all makes sense. If you think that they were either making it up or deceiving people, then yeah, the rest of it doesn't make sense. And a good example of that is this issue of the two sets of plates that I've written about, which we don't have time to get into, but you can read about it on the various blogs and websites. The next part of this is, well, regardless of the origin and setting of the Book of Mormon, what evidence is there today that the church is led by God? And it doesn't take much inquiry into the modern church as of today. This is what are we, in August of 2024, to see how the prophecies are being fulfilled right in front of our eyes. I remember when I was a young missionary, this is 50 years ago now, LeGrand Richards came and said, the day will come and there will be temples all over the world, and now we're seeing that being fulfilled 50 years later. At the time, it didn't even seem possible.
Yeah.
We're seeing the fulfillment of the prophecies about the gospel being taken to the entire world.
Yeah.
And when we're watching these things transpire right in front of our eyes, it's difficult for us to become that blind to what's happening, I guess is one way to put it. Yet another element of all this is all the good the church is doing, and not only in terms of missionary work, but in terms of educating the saints throughout the world through the Pathway program and the universities and so on, through doing charitable works with humanitarian efforts throughout the world, regardless of denomination.
Yep, billions
through
of
creating
dollars.
communities of believers in Christ who are striving to live Christ-like lives. Everywhere I've gone in the world, there's communities, LDS communities of like-minded people who are devoted to Christ, who want to live righteous lives and help build a kingdom. And all these things are in fulfillment of the prophecies, but they're also improving lives for everybody. And there's always detractors. I know there's the anti-Mormon, former Mormon groups that point to instances of abuse, maybe by a church leader or a fellow member of the church. But that's true everywhere. When we lived in Africa, we were in Mauritius, and it's a predominantly Hindu country, or nation. And there's anti-Hindus that live there that point out the problems with the Hinduism, some abuse here or there.
Sure.
And it's the same with the anti-Catholics or the anti-Muslims or the anti-whoever, because of human nature. And that's part of the gospel message, is that we're all fallen. We all make mistakes. We all, if we aspire to be like Christ, we try to overcome those mistakes and do better. But just because people make mistakes doesn't mean that their aspirations and their beliefs are wrong. So I think the critics are what I call them, what was the term I used? Anyway, I had a term for them, that they're basically profiting off the misfortunes of others and trying to detract from the real good that the church does throughout the world.
Well, I do want to thank you, and that not just for taking the time and accepting my invitation, but the years and hours you've invested to seek out, no matter what it would take you, and writing it down and providing MOBOM, which is what I call it, MOBOM, to remember it easy.org.
Yeah.
I don't need to call it because I have the link down in the description. I read the first page, the translation of that first page. Phenomenal, Jonathan. Just so right there that people can read it and judge for themselves what you've been saying throughout this hour and a half. But I thank you for all that you've done. And I'm adding that in, and this video will be going out here in a day or so, but I will say that there's so much. If you're looking and if you're struggling and have some doubt, fine. But if you're looking to find evidence and truth on both sides and weighing both sides, you're going to find your marker move close to the probability of the Book of Mormon is true. But if you're looking for evidence to say against it, and you're quickly willing to accept it without any real true digestion of it all, then you're going to find the negative, and I wish you well. I'm just saddened that you won't consider both sides truly and pray about it. But you've given us a lot of information, and I thank you. And success to you. I know you've got some special things coming for you and your wife here in the future soon, and I'll be praying for you. You've got a lot of things you're carrying in your head and heart when you go wherever you're going to go. But I just want you to know that from what I've seen on those videos on that bond, all the podcasts, a lot of information, everybody. Go to it and enjoy it. But until next time, I want to wish everyone continued success. And I hope those who are struggling or have questions will do the research that we suggest, especially check out the books that Jonathan has put together and all the references and things that he has on that website. It will be a healing thing for you to get it in and read it and experience it. But until next time, I wish you continued success. Goodbye.
Okay, bye.